Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bob Schertz, Vice President of the Road to Victory Military Museum, and we're glad to have you here and want to introduce you to some of the items, some of the artifacts in our museum, the Road to Victory Military Museum in Stuart, Florida. We're a living, working museum. We teach people about the history and sacrifice and valor of all the servicemen who gave the last full measure and those who are still living with us today. We remember the POWs, the MIAs. We remember the places they went, from Iwo Jima to Frozen Chosin to Iraq, Afghanistan, and we preserve those great feats of honor. So welcome to our museum, and we're glad that you're here. We're here today at the Road to Victory Military Museum in Stuart, Florida. My name is Bob Schertz. I'm Vice President of the museum, and wanted to talk to you a little bit about the American Civil War and some of the aspects that you may or may not be familiar with. But I got to ask you a question first. Have you seen the elephant? You probably don't know what that means, but it meant a lot to those who served in the Civil War. Seeing the elephant was a big deal back then, and to those who served, it meant you had served in combat. You'd had your first taste of battle. So those that had seen the elephant had been in at least some kind of battle or skirmish. The Civil War was a terrible time for the U.S., divided nations, the North and the South. It was about slavery, it was about economic issues, it was about states' rights versus federal rights, and it all boiled down into one hellacious time for the United States. You had people that were divided between the North and South. Maryland, for example, had an equal number of people who served in the Confederate forces, about 13,000, and 13,000 in the Northern forces. And when Lincoln was coming in to take office, they had to guard it when he went into Baltimore. He had to sneak into Washington, D.C. To presume the office of the presidency. There were riots when they started to do the recruitments for volunteers for the initial start of the Civil War. A lot of training in the efforts of those who were the generals, commanders during the Civil War, focused on Napoleonic tactics, which kept all the troops close together and enabled them to actually guard against cavalry at times when they'd form a square. But the developments in technology was far exceeding the capabilities of the commanders on the field, because they were not used to how deadly the lead bullets were going to them, and they were subsonic, so they were not sterile bullets. You could almost guarantee an infection if you were hit by one of these huge lead bullets. And they were subsonic, so you could actually hear them whiz by like a hornet or an angry bee. And that's pretty much the way it was when you were facing off amongst each other. And when the guy next to you fell, you closed the ranks. They had an easy target. Once you fired your musket, you had 9 steps to reload it. So while you're doing that, you'll probably kneel. You'd be down like this, reloading your musket, while they're firing at you, and your rear ranks are firing over your head. 9 steps. They were expected to do 3 rounds a minute. That was the regulation considered for the regular army, to fire those 3 rounds. And they had and carried in their satchel about 75 rounds. And that included a little packet with a musket ball in it, black powder. They also had a cap box at their side here, which contained fulminate and mercury. and they would put that on the nipple after they've loaded their rifle and come to the ready and be given the order to aim and fire. And that's pretty much how the muskets went. Food was pretty good for the northern troops, not so good for the southern troops. The northern troops wanted to go through the Shenandoah Valley. They eliminated and burned a lot of the crops that the Virginians were relying on. And it was a horrendous time there, a lot of shortages. The North had the manufacturing. The North had the money and capability and logistics to support their army in the field a lot better than the Southern. And it's amazing that the Southern put such a fight together against the Northern enemy. And it was Johnny Reb and Billy Yank. They fought each other. Many of the times, they would get passes to go back and forth to meet with relatives from their commander. And at Fredericksburg in particular, those from the north would be sending their supplies over to the south, and the Southerners would send tobacco to the north side of the banks of the river, and they would exchange, greetings and things like that. And it was pretty casual when they weren't exactly firing at each other. They'd be conducted on Sundays to church services on the northern or southern side, and then they'd go through the lines and then be at the ready to fight each other at a moment's notice. Horrendous time for the soldier in the field. A lot of casualties due to secondary problems such as dysentery, things of that nature, infections. If you were wounded, almost guarantee you would lose that limb. And as far as antiseptics and that kind of thing went, they were pretty much non-existent. They would just wipe off their blades and start with the next guy that needed to be serviced. And it would be like they would sew up the veins and everything. And in 10 days, they would pull this little string. And if it came out without opening up any of the veins, the guy would survive. If not, they would bleed out. So one of the terrible things about the Civil War, the North had an advantage. They had anesthetics, and they used them. The Southern, not so much. They had alcohol, and they used that quite regularly. Things that you may not be familiar with is people carrying swords and that. You probably thought, well, they probably poke people with it. But unless you were in cavalry, you didn't use it to actually hurt anybody. You used it to direct your troops. And you would point directions, go to the right, go to the left, hold, come to attention. But a lot of the romanticists would tell you that's what those swords were for. They were more like a tool to direct the troops. There was one general, a Union general, his name was Dan Butterfield, and he decided that his units would have a prelude call. And the prelude call was da 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 da. That was like basically Dan Butterfield. And when his troops heard that, they knew the next call was their call to either go forward, to retreat, or whatever direction the bugle called for. And he did one more thing with the Civil War, and we still play that song today. It's known as taps. And that was done, and it was like originally known as Day is Done. So the reason we have taps is going back to Dan Butterfield during the Civil War, and they still play that to honor servicemen, those that given the last full measure in their lives for their country. And there's other things in the Civil War you probably don't know much about, is the fact that everything had to be loaded individually. Every shell had to be put into the weapon. First you had to put the black powder in, which would go in here. Then you'd compress it. Then you would put the bullet in, compress that, and you would put something to seal the bullet in the chamber. And you had to do that and make sure that no black powder was existing on the rim here. Because if you didn't, you could get a chain fire, and all 6 of these could fire simultaneously. And that's bad news for you, more so than the enemy. They had a lot of innovations during the Civil War. One was the Henry rifle. Well, everybody else was firing 3 rounds a minute. The Henry rifle could fire as fast as you could pull the trigger. And they used to say things about the Henry rifle, such as, you load it on Sunday and fire all week. But the Union Army didn't adapt it because the man in charge of logistics said, well, the soldiers would just waste the ammunition. So they went the old way until finally Lincoln ordered him to start buying these Henry rifles, which was an amazing design, an incredible design, because while the other side is firing their round, after they fire that round, they have to reload. You can still fire. So a company that had all these Henry rifles could just really lay into the enemy and obliterate them. They also had changes in communication. The telegraph was an integral part. They were receiving reports from the front, from the battlefield right there at the White House, and they knew exactly what was going on during the Civil War, and balloons were utilized. They put balloons up in the air, and of course that always meant that you were going to get shot at quite a bit. But they had observation balloons all over, both north and south. The Signal Corps became an integral part of the Army, letting each element know what their troops are supposed to do. So this was an amazing piece of history. And towards the end of the Civil War, around Petersburg, you actually see some of the things leading into World War I. They were digging trenches. They had opposing trenches all over the place encircling Petersburg. An unfortunate thing around Petersburg, they got all these Pennsylvania miners to dig a tunnel underneath the bulwarks at Petersburg. And they placed a lot of TNT underneath those bulwarks. And they had a corps of people ready and trained to go take that pulpit once the explosion occurred. And that crater is still there today. The problem is, they decided not to put those people in that crater. They had a bunch of black troops, and they wanted to get them in the battle, so they sent them in right after the explosion. Unfortunately, they marched them right into the crater, not onto the rims, and the Southerners were shooting at them from the top of the parapet. And they had a lot of casualties due to that. A guy who used to be at the initial battle, the guy's name was McLean, he had moved away from all the noise into a nice quiet place known as Appomattox, and he opened up his store there. So basically, the battle and the Civil War started and ended in the area where McLean lived. Just a simple guy. And the South was surprised at the terms that Grant gave them. They were paroled. They were allowed to return home. And it was a generous thing that he did. And that's some of the things about the Civil War you may not be aware of.